Aspen and birch trees flew by outside the train window, translucent against the vast endless fields behind them. October, nearing its end, was swiftly erasing the remnants of golden autumn, as if hurrying to take away everything that reminded people of sunshine and bright colours. Arleen moved away from the window, tucking her neck and chin deeper into her jacket collar and burying her hands in her pockets. She wore sunglasses, inappropriate for such a cloudy, sunless day, but they made her feel safer and calmer. The train car was nearly empty, save for an elderly man a few rows ahead, identifiable by his tired, slouching back and grey hair, and closer to the exit a quintessential middle-aged gardener, surrounded by bucket of late-harvest apples, her determined face clearly showing her disappointment at having no one to talk to during the journey. Arleen enjoyed train rides, sitting unhurried, listening to the rhythmic clatter of wheels, feeling her thoughts gradually slow to match their measured pace. She needed that calmness now more than ever. Arleen had no idea where she was going or why. No one awaited her, and she herself expected almost nothing from life any more. The young woman couldn't help contemplating what to do next with her strange, seemingly ridiculous life. Surprisingly, Arleen considered her childhood happy, at least from age 2. She arrived at the orphanage at age 2, and Mrs. Minton entered her life. "Hello, what's your name?" Mrs. Minton asked, approaching the little girl. Looking closer, the woman sighed with admiration. The girl's tangled hair was remarkably beautiful, thick and dense, a rich wheat honey colour. Arleen raised her eyes to Mrs. Minton's, and the woman's heart melted. They were green, with a confident, mischievous expression unusual for an orphaned child. "My name is Arleen. And yours?" the little girl answered seriously, maintaining eye contact. "My name is Sarah Minton." "So, Sarah," Arleen decided instantly. Despite the orphanage staff's efforts, the stubborn girl refused to use her teacher's full name. Eventually they gave up, and the widely respected Mrs. Minton remained simply Sarah to her. From an early age, as Mrs. Minton recalled, Arleen made her own decision. "Sarah, I want to take up judo," Arleen announced unexpectedly one day. "What? Judo? But you're a girl," Mrs. Minton responded, both shocked and indignant. "So what if I'm a girl? I'm going to do judo." Arleen gave her teacher a defiant look, furrowing her brow as usual. "I've already visited the school and enrolled in classes." Mrs. Minton shook her head with a smile and arranged trainings for the girl. "Mrs. Minton, I've decided to become an accountant," Arleen announced near the end of the last year at school. "You? An accountant?" Mrs. Minton shook her head in disbelief. "With your algebra grades?" "I have a whole year left," Arleen replied firmly, and put her best efforts to improve her knowledge and enroll college. Arleen felt good at college. For the first time in her life, she felt like just another person, one of many, no different from the rest. That was the paradox. While most people strive to stand out from the crowd, to become as noticeable as possible, Arleen tired of the orphanage stigma and strived for the opposite. She was comfortable among her simple, not particularly wealthy classmates. At the end of third year, a guy named Kenneth joined their group. Just another guy, nothing special, Arleen decided. But after she helped him escape from some drunk guys at a disco using a few clever moves, he developed boundless respect for her, and they became friends. One evening after class, they sat on a bench, chatting cheerfully about nothing. "Arleen, have you thought about an internship?" "I'll probably go to my orphanage and ask to work in their accounting department." What can you learn there? Counting sheets and diapers? Listen, why are you pestering me? I'll figure it out myself, Arleen replied, trying to end the uncomfortable conversation. Wait, don't get angry. I have an offer. My uncle has a firm. They sell supplements. Are you interested in an internship there? And if they like you, they might hire you after college. Arleen looked at him incredulously. Really? Are you serious? I'm an orphanage girl, Kenneth. So? What's that got to do with anything? Kenneth looked at her cheerfully. You're an excellent student. My uncle doesn't need a blue-blooded countess. He needs an accountant. So, deal? I'll call him today and tell him you're coming. When Arleen arrived at Kenneth's uncle's firm for her internship, she found a company with an impressively long name, occupying an entire floor in a large office centre. The huge room was arranged in the style she'd seen in movies, computers and photocopiers everywhere, young professionals hurrying between desks, endless phone conversations, and fingers flying across keyboards. Everything was in motion, giving the impression of a successful, forward-thinking business. After the bustle of the sales department, the accounting department was an oasis of calm. They sat Arleen in a corner with an impressive stack of papers and asked her to check for stamps on all documents. Though the task was basic, Arleen was happy. She had gotten into a real commercial firm, and life here was clearly thriving. She would gain experience, become an excellent accountant, and maybe even become a manager someday. Best of all, she'd make good money. Delighted with her first day, she called Kenneth that evening and thanked him profusely. Come on, Arleen, it's nothing. We look after our own, he answered cheerfully. The remainder of studying flew by, and Arleen received her diploma. Kenneth kept his word about the job, and in early September, Arleen was hired as an accountant at his uncle's company, which imported and sold dietary supplements. Arleen had never used such preparations herself. The young woman received a good salary regularly, though the work wasn't particularly difficult. Arleen checked warehouse inventory, printed shipping documents at the salespeople's request, and delivered them to the warehouse. After 3 months at the firm, the director called her in. "Well, how have you settled in?" he asked, laughing gleefully, as was his habit. "Thank you, I hope I'm doing well," Arleen replied shyly. "Don't be modest. Everyone praises you," the chief said generously. "Well done. I want to promote you. Starting tomorrow, you'll be my senior accountant for shipments." Arleen couldn't believe her ears. Only 3 months of work and already a promotion. It seemed like a fairy tale. And she wasn't even 20 yet. What would come next? Then everything happened very simply. A couple of weeks later, Arleen arrived at work and immediately found herself in the tight grip of a masked man in camouflage. She was roughly pushed into the nearest office. Until today, it had belonged to their commercial director. The office was strangely bare. No laptop that usually sat on the desk. No enormous mug with "Genius" written on it. "Your documents," ordered a man in police uniform. After checking her passport, he tossed it onto the table. "Well, tell me the whole story," he drawled, staring at Arleen. "Tell you what," she whispered, her lips white. The officer's gaze terrified her. "Everything in detail. How and to whom you sold uncertified products, where the money went. Everything." The intimidating man rocked in his chair silently. "I have nothing to tell," Arleen said, her mouth dry and nausea rising in her throat. "Of course. The good old I don't know anything, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything." He laughed. The next day they called her for questioning. Listen, Arleen Tanner, we don't need to prove anything. Your signature is on the documents shipping fake products. Any expert analysis will confirm this. If you maintain your innocence, claiming you know nothing, you'll still get a sentence. The maximum. 5 years. And if what you've been selling is classified as poison, even longer. The investigator leaned back. If you confess, write it all down honestly, he continued, suddenly switching to the informal you. I promise special consideration and 2 years maximum. Then you'll get parole. Do you know what parole is? Arleen shook her head fearfully. You'll get out earlier with good behaviour. Besides, why fear going to the zone? You've been, in the zone all your life. He was clearly pleased with his witty remark. Arleen felt physically ill from this man's presence and his cruel words. She could barely think, her mind clouded by hunger, exhaustion and fear. Come on, Tanner. Decide quickly. I don't have all day to sit here with you, the interrogator barked. Arleen saw Mrs. Minton before the trial. The woman looked terrible, as if she might die right after hearing the verdict, which Arleen received as dry, indifferent legal jargon. It was over. Life stopped for 6 long years. Her sentence for illegal production, sale of substances and their analogues, which their supplements were deemed to be. None of her colleagues appeared beside her in court. The interrogator's promise of a reduced sentence for confession proved completely false. Mrs. Minton never recovered from the shock. A few months after the trial, while Arleen was in the colony, she learned that the only person who had ever loved her had quietly died of heart failure. Arleen wanted to forget the years she spent in the penal colony, to erase that time completely from her life, but she knew this was naive. No one would let her forget her past. To the stigma of being from the children's home was added another, far worse, convict. Nothing could change that, but one thing remained in Arleen's power: to prevent this darkness from defining her, from growing inside and becoming her essence. The train stopped at some station, waited the required time, and continued on. Through the vestibule noise came loud talking, thumping against walls and harsh laughter. Minutes later, the inner door slid open, and 3 men entered, their unwashed hair hanging in greasy clumps, eyes narrowed menacingly, mouths fixed in perpetual sneers. Shouting and cursing with every word, they swaggered down the aisle like they owned it. Thugs, thought Arleen indifferently, closing her eyes. I mustn't interfere. I'm not allowed to. Immediately she heard an indignant woman's voice. Stop! Hey, what are you doing with your hands? Someone call the police! Her screaming suddenly ended in a gurgle. Arleen's eyes snapped open as she jerked upright, instantly alert. The woman sat clutching her stomach, eyes bulging, mouth gaping helplessly. Buckets lay overturned, apples scattered across the car. The men stomped on the bright, juicy fruit with hoarse laughter, crushing them to pulp. An elderly man Arleen had noticed earlier was rising from his seat. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, the most pointless question possible. Here we go, Arleen thought grimly. It's starting. Her trained body tensed and positioned itself, arms slightly bent at the elbows, legs tucking under the bench. This happened automatically, independent of conscious thought. Just as an animal's muscles prepare for attack, her body responded to the situation. "Oh, Defender Knight!" One of the guys, clearly the oldest in the group, spread his arms and bowed mockingly. "Is that your girlfriend?" They laughed in unison.
Well, now you're going to pay for you and your girlfriend. Come on, what have you got in your pockets?" "Young men!"
The man stumbled. It seemed repulsive to speak normally to those who had long ago lost their human appearance and ability to think.
"We are young people, and you're an old stump. We're going to speed up your funeral."
The guy shoved the man hard against the bench, striking his face simultaneously. Something metallic glinted in the thug's hands. A knife or brass knuckles, Arleen wondered, making a mental note that the armed attacker would need to be neutralized first.
"Hey guys, back off before you get hurt."
Arleen's voice cut through the air, drowning out the sounds of the rowdy group. The carriage fell silent, except for the quiet moans of the beaten woman.
"What?"
The leader finally spoke, obviously recovering from his shock.
"What did you say?"
"You heard me. Take your filthy gang and get out of here fast. But apologize first." The guy looked like he might burst. His face, ears, and neck flushed purple. His accomplices stood behind him, managing meaningless glances, clearly waiting for their leader's command. Arleen sized them up instantly. Drunk, high, or both, they posed no real challenge to her. She felt no fear. She knew she could handle all three, especially the one who could barely stand. The issue wasn't their threat level. She just wanted to avoid trouble. With her parole certificate at stake, she didn't need police involvement. Though she knew these degenerates only understood force, she still hoped for a peaceful resolution. She rose smoothly from the bench, unzipped her jacket and positioned herself about 10 steps from the boys. A knife after all, she realized, before the man could reach her. She met him with her shoulder and twisted his knife hand in one fluid motion, dropping him to the floor with a pain-filled shriek. After delivering 2 solid kicks, she sent the fallen knife skidding under the benches and faced his companions. It took mere seconds. "Well, losers, who's next?" she taunted. No one stepped forward. "Then get out, now!" The guys quickly collected their leader, who lay crumpled on the floor, and hurried toward the exit as the train slowed for another station. "Police!" the woman suddenly screamed, now that danger had passed, and she felt bold enough to demand justice. Arleen glanced anxiously at her and, buttoning her jacket, walked to the opposite end of the carriage. She decided to exit at the next station as a precaution.
"Girl, please wait,"
she heard behind her. Arleen turned. The elderly man hurried after her. His refined professional face, as Arleen had labelled it, remained agitated, with a bruise swelling rapidly on his cheekbone.
"Wait! How can you let them go like this? They need to face the police. They must be held accountable,"
the man said, breathing heavily as he walked. "Look, I'm not getting involved. If you want to pursue it, that's your choice," she replied, continuing toward the vestibule. The man, no longer insisting, stopped and moved to the last seat before the exit. Arleen entered the vestibule and leaned back against the wall, watching the street through the shaking door window. At the next stop, she stepped off and breathed in the fresh, damp autumn air with pleasure. The light rain that had fallen throughout the journey had ceased. Checking the posted schedule, Arleen saw that she had nearly 40 minutes until the next train.
"Sweet girl, forgive my persistence,"
came a voice from behind. The elderly man from the carriage had followed her onto the platform. Arleen startled. Her eyes stung inexplicably, her throat tight. No one had called her sweet girl in years, with simple human warmth, free of mockery or crude implications.
"I followed you. I'm sorry. I must thank you. You saved me too. I understand why you avoided further trouble, to protect yourself."
"I understand that,"
But think of others. They'll continue this behaviour. People will suffer. They need to face consequences.
Look, please leave me alone. Just back off, grandfather, the young woman snapped, hoping to discourage him from a 40-minute lecture until the next train arrived. The man seemed to realise she had no interest in discussing reform strategies for train hooligans and stepped aside. The train arrived punctually. Arleen inhaled deeply, gladly entered the car, settled into a corner window seat and stretched her legs. The old man boarded the same car, sitting several rows away but facing Arleen. The day's early start was taking its toll. Arleen began nodding off to the rhythmic clatter of wheels. She jolted awake as the train stopped, and opening her eyes she flinched. The persistent old man now sat directly across from her, studying her face intently. After she met his gaze, he became visibly excited. Some kind of lunatic, Arleen thought wearily, standing up. The man followed. As she walked along the platform toward the city exit, she sensed him behind her. Her patience wearing thin, she stopped abruptly and turned. "What do you want from me? Make it quick!" She narrowed her eyes menacingly. Please, forgive my pestering, but your face, your eyes, haven't we met before?" The old man peered at her imploringly. "No, we haven't. I'd remember you. You're impossible to forget. You're so persistent and annoying." Arleen tried to escape the man's presence. "I'm sorry. I started the conversation wrong. My name is Mr. Toffler. Would you allow me to know your name?" Arleen was shocked by the elegance of the phrase addressed to her. Despite her intention to get rid of the persistent old man quickly, Arleen found herself responding, Arleen Tanner." "Nice to meet you, Arleen. We've introduced to each other, so now you won't be able to refuse me if I invite you for a cup of coffee," said Mr. Toffler, stopping in front of the coffee house's huge floor-to-ceiling window. Behind the glass flowed a leisurely, unhurried, incredibly cosy life. The soft light of small lamps flickered, and just one glance at the plush sofas with cushions made her whole body ache with desire to sink into them. All this was so strikingly different from what had surrounded Arleen for the last years in prison that she longed to plunge into this magical life, to feel like a normal person. The door to the coffee shop opened, letting visitors out onto the street. The enticing smell of coffee and fresh pastries wafted toward them. Arleen's stomach rumbled so loudly that she worried everyone on the street must have heard it. "Arleen, I insist. I must thank you somehow for my rescue," said the man, gesturing invitingly toward the cafe. Half an hour later, they were sitting at a cafe table, chatting easily. More precisely, Mr. Toffler did most of the talking, while Arleen listened and ate, savouring every bite of the delicious food. "Arleen, forgive me, but I must ask something that's been bothering me. Are you certain we haven't met somewhere before?" He looked at her pleadingly. "No, Mr. Toffler, we couldn't have met, that's for sure. 4 years ago, I graduated from college. Before that, I lived in an orphanage. And lately, I've been vacationing at a prison, from where I'm now following my place of registration." Having finished, Arleen leaned back in her chair and watched the elderly man expectantly. She anticipated his benign, intelligent face would show horror, fright, priggishness, all the typical reactions people have toward an orphanage child who's been in prison. She expected him to jump up, yell, perhaps even accuse her of tricking him into the cafe. Arleen was prepared for any reaction, but what happened next caught her completely off guard. Mr. Toffler froze with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, then carefully set it on its saucer and laughed. He laughed so genuinely and infectiously that Arleen couldn't help but smile herself, though God knows there was nothing funny in what she had just said. After his laughter subsided, Mr. Toffler said,
"Well, Arleen, you are full of surprises. You're truly remarkable. Would you like something more to eat?"
"No, thank you," Arleen replied timidly. "I'm about to burst as it is."
"Well then, tell me, where exactly are you headed? Someone's expecting you, I hope?"
"No one," said Arleen thoughtfully, twirling her teaspoon.
"Arleen, dear, I'd like to be of more help to you than just buying you dinner. Perhaps you need a place to live, money, or a job."
"Listen, Mr. Toffler," Arleen set her spoon down with a clink. "Did you hear me clearly? Do you understand who I am? I'm an ex-convict with a record and a very, as they say, dubious past. I just got out, you know."
"I heard you perfectly well, Arleen, and I understand everything," Mr. Toffler answered calmly. "I'm offering you help, fully aware of the situation. I know you're tired and need to rest. Look around, get settled. If you need my help, please call me."
He handed Arleen a business card.
"My son owns a business. We'll certainly find you a job."
"Thank you," Arleen mumbled, staring at the tablecloth. When she finally reached home, she washed and scrubbed herself for a long time, rinsing her hair and skin until the shampoo ran out, as if trying to wash away all the dirt people had thrown at her. The next day, after registering with the district police officer, she went looking for work. After receiving several outright rejections, where they didn't even try to hide the reason, she decided to try the employment centre. Watching the girl at the registration handle her release certificate with 2 fingers, as if afraid of contamination, Arleen realised she couldn't endure such humiliation. Well, nobody forced him to offer, Arleen thought a day later as she dialed Mr. Toffler's number. "Hello, it's Arleen," she said childishly into the receiver.
"Arleen!" came the old man's joyful exclamation. "Now I have your number."
The day before, Mr. Toffler had visited his son's office. He rarely did this, trying not to distract Andrew from the complex task of managing his vast hotel and restaurant enterprise. His son was a classic workaholic who had built a fortune and a stellar reputation, but had somehow missed his chance at happiness. Now, the elderly man had come to tell his son about the incident on the commuter train and about Arleen. After Mr. Toffler detailed yesterday's events, showing the bruise on his face, Andrew whistled in surprise.
"Well, Dad, you really got yourself into something. What were you even doing on that train? Is it so difficult to call for a car and driver? Like I've asked you to many times." "Andrew, that's not the point right now. I want to help this girl, I really do." "Well, what do you want me to do, Dad? Let's give her whatever money she needs. A lot of money. And let's end this discussion, okay?" "Money, money, money," Mr. Toffler exclaimed. "You can't see past the money. She's a human being, wounded, exhausted." "Oh, Papa, please. From what you've told me, she can beat up anybody. No, Dad. The image of a poor, defenceless girl doesn't quite fit," said Andrew. "Enough!" the old man shouted at his son, as if addressing a delinquent schoolboy rather than the owner of a big company. "If it weren't for that girl, you'd be identifying me in the morgue right now." Silence fell over the office. "Okay, Dad, I'm sorry. So what do you want?" "You want me to get her a job." "Okay, I'll see what I can do. And I'll instruct my personnel department." "No, you have to see her yourself, talk to her, At least do it for me."
Mr. Toffler was inexorable.
"You must see her."
He emphasised the last word meaningfully.
"What for?"
Andrew said tiredly.
"Dad, I don't even meet the heads of our other offices myself. And here's some girl who's been in prison. I don't care about your branch managers, but this girl matters. Andrew, darling, I don't know what's going on here, but she's extraordinary. She came from nothing, yet there's not a trace of hardship about her. I saw her for an hour and a half, and I wouldn't have guessed she'd been in jail if she hadn't told me. I'll tell you something else. She's also from an orphanage."
Mr. Toffler grinned, seeing his son roll his eyes in anguish.
"All right, I won't bother you any more. If she calls me, I'll let you know."
And Mr. Toffler left his son's office. Half an hour later, Andrew gave his security chief the task of finding out as much as possible about his father's acquaintance. And a few hours later, a report lay before Andrew, detailing Arleen's short but turbulent life, most importantly, the circumstances of her conviction. Being well versed in business, Andrew immediately recognised that the case had been fabricated, with Arleen serving as a scapegoat for others. He had obtained a photocopy of her prisoner photo. Though blurry and showing the horror on her face from her early days in prison, something about it struck Andrew. Intrigued by the girl, he decided to honour his father's request and meet this strange acquaintance. On the appointed day, Arleen entered the business centre and ascended to the 20th floor. "Hello, are you Arleen Tanner? Andrew is waiting for you. Please come in," the strikingly beautiful secretary said sweetly. Arleen gathered her courage, took a deep breath, as she always did before sparring, and entered the office. The space was enormous, with panoramic windows offering such a spectacular view of the city that Arleen momentarily forgot why she was there. She smiled shyly at the lean, trim man in the impeccable suit. His thick, wheat-coloured hair showed only touches of grey. "Hello, Andrew. Thank you for your time. Frankly, I don't know why I would interest you. You probably know my story, but Mr. Toffler—" Arleen stopped mid-sentence. She noticed the office owner's expression. He hadn't spoken a word, but his eyes were fixed on her face, as if trying to see through her. "Tell me, what was your mother's name?" Andrew asked unexpectedly. "My mother?" Arleen asked, surprised. Having lived most of her life without a mother, such questions were unfamiliar. "Her name was Stacy, according to my birth certificate, anyway." "Stacy Tanner? How old are you?" "No, wait, don't answer that, I'll guess." He sat at his desk, grabbed a pen, and began scribbling frantically in his notebook. "It was the end of '98, the last time she disappeared." Arleen caught fragments of his muttering. "You're 25 now, right?" Andrew suddenly asked, throwing down his pen. Arleen nodded. "Your father, what's his name? Where is he?" His interrogation grew more intense, his voice becoming eerily strained. "That's something I know nothing about," Arleen replied ironically. "There's just a dash in that column on my birth certificate." "My God, Stacy Tanner! Those eyes! That hair! It can't be!" Andrew paced the huge office, stopping and starting erratically. "Such coincidences don't happen. 25 years old. The hair, the eyes. Yes, there are many Tanners, but everything else. It's like something from a melodrama." With each passing minute, he appeared more unhinged. Arleen began calculating whether she could reach the door before this apparent madman caught her. As if reading her thoughts, Andrew approached with pleading hands. Tears welled in his eyes. "Arleen, forgive me, I must seem insane.
I can't explain anything right now. I need to think to verify things, but your appearance here, it's incredible. We'll meet again later, okay? I promise not to frighten you again. I'm terrified myself. It's like a dream. Now you should go."
Arleen fled the office, bewildered and deeply unsettled. One thing was certain, she would never return here. The employment service seemed a better option now. That evening, father and son sat in Andrew's spacious apartment. The father silently watched his typically composed and reserved son alternate between sitting, jumping up, and grasping a glass of whiskey, only to freeze before drinking it. "Dad!" Andrew abruptly sat and placed the untouched glass on the table. "Dad, it's her! Stacy's daughter. She's 24. Do you understand what that means?" Unable to stay seated, he resumed pacing. "It means she might be your daughter too." Mr. Toffler finally voiced what his son feared to say. "What are you looking at? I am pretty sure she's your daughter. She looks just like you did at 24. That's why I was staring at her on the train. I see my Andrew sitting across from me. Only a girl." His father tried to defuse the situation with a joke to calm Andrew down. "Is that why you said I had to see her?" "Yes, because I knew you wouldn't believe me. You'll think I'm out of my mind." "Dad, do you remember her, Stacy?" Father and son fell silent, immersed in memories of many years ago. Stacy was a living landmark of their small, cosy regional town, where one half of the inhabitants knew everything about the other half. Stacy was born into a well-to-do family of quiet, modest intellectuals who had already despaired of having children. Her mother, Arleen, was a paediatrician at the children's clinic. The woman possessed an incredible kindness that radiated to everyone around her. Babies who had been crying in the corridor would fall silent as if by magic the moment they entered her office. She needed only to touch a baby and speak a few words in her quiet, enveloping voice. The whole district cherished their paediatrician, who worked tirelessly, helping to raise generation after generation of children, while remaining childless herself. Charlene's husband John, an engineer, whose specialization was something to do with gas or oil, led a nomadic life for many years. He would appear at home briefly, stay for a few days, then disappear for months. "Well, what kind of a family life is that?" neighbours would ask each other meaningfully. Eventually, though, John settled down at home. Then, to the neighbourhood's amazement and joy, Charlene appeared with a clearly visible belly. "Finally!" exhaled the shopkeepers and others who were delighted for Charlene, who was literally glowing with happiness. Finally a girl was born, and they named her Stacy. "My, what voice she has!" laughed an elderly nurse, bringing the baby to Charlene's room. "In all my years, I've never heard such a strong voice. She's stunned everyone." Charlene smiled happily as she took her screaming treasure into her arms. From birth, Stacy was the centre of attention. Being a late and incredibly long-awaited child, she naturally received not only boundless love, but also an extra measure of anxious care and concern from her parents. However, showing an independent character early on that didn't tolerate excessive coddling, Stacy calmly handled her childhood challenges on her own. She was restless, boyishly active. At home they called her the devil in a skirt, though she rarely wore girls' clothes. Her hands were always scratched, her knees perpetually bruised. Charlene would periodically sigh while pulling another charming dress from the closet, one Stacy had outgrown without ever wearing. "Don't worry, she'll grow up, settle down, and become a proper young lady like you," John would console his wife with a smile. Years passed, and Stacy grew and changed. She eventually stopped running wild around the yard and participating in boys' skirmishes. Her parents channeled her excess energy in a constructive direction by enrolling her in volleyball. Then suddenly, as often happens with children who grow up before everyone's eyes like trees in the yard, yesterday's pretty girl blossomed into an almost otherworldly beauty. Years of volleyball completed the transformation of this duckling, though she was never ugly, into a beautiful swan. By the last grade, Stacey had definitively become the school's star. Though her academic performance wasn't stellar, she maintained satisfactory grades. Above all else, Stacey was absolutely and unshakably convinced of her own exceptionalism. Her belief that the world revolved exclusively around her had taken root in early childhood and never wavered. Her parents tried to temper their daughter's pride, but they could do little to change it now, having made her the family's idol for so many years. Having received her school certificate with more C's than B's, Stacey faced a choice. She could either bury herself in textbooks to prepare for university or college exams, or find a job. But neither option interested her. Accustomed to universal admiration, Stacey believed conquering the universe required just one step: moving to the capital, where she imagined all the world's blessings would instantly fall at her feet. Like hundreds of thousands of young girls who make this journey every year, Stacey left to conquer the capital. Though she had been the leading beauty of her small town district, in the capital she immediately became just another face among countless provincial beauties. The capital remained indifferent to her pretty face, slender figure and lush hair. There was an abundance of such here, but money was needed here first of all, for housing and food. Initially, Stacey tried living in a rented apartment with a friend who had moved to the capital a year earlier. However, this arrangement proved problematic. The apartment was tiny, and the friend's boyfriend also lived there. Leading fashion designers and famous directors, as it turned out, to Stacey's regret, weren't roaming the streets searching for new catwalk or screen stars, and they certainly weren't rushing to call Stacey. The job she found was far from what she'd imagined, while admiring herself in the mirror at home and listening to praises of her beauty. She had to take a job as a waitress in a small restaurant. Reality quickly shattered Stacey's romantic notion of a waitress as an elegantly dressed girl floating around with a tray collecting tips. Instead, she had to wash dishes and floors, launder and iron tablecloths, receive deliveries and handle countless other endless tasks typical of such establishments. Soon, she found separate lodging. It was a tiny room in a poor neglected apartment that had never seen renovation, but the landlady Gina was a kind gentlewoman who didn't charge exorbitant rent. Gradually, Stacey even became friends with Gina. The harsh reality that confronted Stacey frightened her, but the girl didn't consider returning to her parents. That morning promised nothing good. Firstly, Stacey arrived late to work, and at the entrance, instead of encountering Tom, the senior shift manager, who secretly admired her beauty and forgave everything, she ran into Lara, the stern senior administrator, who gleefully fined her. Secondly, Stacey's co-worker had called in sick, meaning she would have to handle double the work. And to top off that, she developed a severe toothache. So bad she considered requesting leave, but the receptionist's glare made it clear that leaving meant not coming back. After half a day of running around with her tooth constantly throbbing, Stacey felt terrible. During a brief lull, she sat down in a corner near the bar. Trying to ease the pulsing pain in her gum, Stacey puffed her cheek, closed her eyes and froze in an awkward comical pose. Suddenly, she felt someone watching her. A tall, handsome young man with unusually coloured blonde hair was observing her.
His hair colour could best be described as honey wheat, which, in Stacy's opinion, clashed with his dark suit. Taking the tray from the counter, Stacy headed toward the wheat-blonde man's table. Just steps away, a sharp pain shot through her teeth, making her vision go dark. She lost her balance for a moment and stumbled. The tray tilted, and its contents flew onto the guest. Roast beef and salad decorated his expensive suit. Naturally, she was fired immediately, despite the uncomfortable visitor's noble intervention. After collecting her meagre final pay and hearing the administrator's assurance that no decent establishment would hire her, Stacy stepped outside. Late autumn greeted her with its characteristic wetness and cold from above and below. She turned up her short jacket's collar and walked slowly toward the subway. Lost in thought, she didn't immediately notice the large car following her. Finally, her peripheral vision caught it, and she stopped. The blonde man, whose suit she had ruined, stepped out of the driver's door. "Hello, Stacy, right?" he asked sheepishly. "So they really did fire you. I'm very sorry about that." "Don't be sorry at all. To hell with that slave labour!" Stacy exclaimed passionately. She laughed, tossing her shoulder-length hair and flashing her green eyes. The man watched her with unconcealed admiration. "You know, you're absolutely right. You should be the one being served, not serving others." He paused briefly. "I may smell like Greek salad thanks to you, but if you'd like, let's go to a restaurant to have lunch. Just promise to keep an eye on the waiter when they bring your order, okay?" the blonde man added with mock seriousness. Stacy laughed heartily. The restaurant where the stranger took Stacy was far more upscale than the one she had worked in just hours ago. During their brief drive of a few blocks, she noted his car was expensive and apparently new. It was an opportunity, one she desperately needed just hours ago, now falling right into her hands. "Oh, Stacy, this may sound cliché, and you probably hear it every day, but you are very gorgeous." Stacy responded with a calculated smile, channeling all her charm and seductiveness. Despite wearing worn-out jeans and a plain, not quite clean sweater, Stacy carried herself as though she dressed in evening wear. Her efforts paid off. Andrew, as the man was called, was completely enchanted. At evening's end, he gazed at Stacy intently, thanked her for a wonderful time and offered to take her home. "Whose home?" Stacy nearly blurted out, but caught herself. Andrew drove her to the house, where she rented a room and, with ceremony, helped her from the car. After kissing her hand and expressing his gratitude once more, he bid her farewell. Well, at least I'd eaten well, Stacy thought with some regret, as she climbed to the 3rd floor. The next morning, Stacy opened her eyes to harsh reality. Looking at the cheap, grimy wallpaper, she remembered she would soon lose even this housing. She needed to find work. The situation was so bleak, she recalled the business card from a cafe regular who had often watched her with platonic interest. Once, tucking his card into the bill folder, he had said, "Listen, sweetheart, when you tire of running with trays, give me a call. We'll find you work worthy of that face of yours. Unlike this." Stacy knew exactly what kind of work he meant, but her upbringing and sense of decency had kept her from that path. Though tempted to destroy the card, she'd kept it. Now, holding that small rectangle of cardboard, Stacy froze. It was frightening. She knew that there would be no going back. Still, clutching the card, she approached the unwashed window. In the yard below stood an expensive car, the kind rarely seen in their suburb. Something about it seemed familiar. The hope that had dimmed after his departure yesterday now blazed anew.
Quickly preparing herself, Stacy checked her reflection and confirmed she looked perfect. She descended the stairs, paused to assume an air of indifference, and emerged, pretending not to notice the car. Andrew leaped out immediately. "Stacy, hello!" His eyes sparkled as he held out a bouquet of white roses. He won't escape me now, Stacy thought. That same evening, Stacy took charge. She overwhelmed the man with dazzling smiles, flirtatious kisses, seemingly accidental touches, and declarations of eternal gratitude. By day's end, his resistance crumbled, and they spent the night together. A week later, she was living in his apartment on the main avenue of the city. It was comfortable and spacious, and though the decor and furniture seemed dated to her, she settled in contentedly. Andrew had fallen deeply, powerfully in love at first sight. In relationships, he was willing to give everything, while content with even minimal signs of affection in return. Stacy graciously allowed herself to be loved, occasionally granting Andrew physical intimacy. Everyone saw the true nature of their relationship, except Andrew. His father attempted difficult conversations several times. "Son, I've never interfered in your personal life, but don't you think—" "No, Dad, I don't, sorry." Even Gina, Stacy's former landlady, with whom she still occasionally spoke and met on neutral ground, remarked with surprise. "I don't understand you, Stacy. What more do you want? Andrew's perfect. You have a luxury apartment. He wants to marry you. He has money. Are you being foolish? When he throws you out for your games, we'll see how you fare." "No, I'm not being foolish. I need more money. Marriage? I couldn't care less. If he buys me my own apartment, maybe I'll consider it. I'll never get his place. It's in his father's name. Throw me out? No way," Stacy laughed. "He'd sooner see an alien." Then something happened that defied all Stacy's plans and calculations. She fell genuinely in love, completely unexpected to herself. What she had once done to Andrew now happened to her. She lost herself entirely in this new man, disregarding all common sense and prospects. She wanted just one thing, to be near her beloved. Stacy left Andrew with only a note saying she was leaving him for someone else. Andrew never saw her again and knew nothing more of her. Andrew returned to the same old house from which he had taken Stacy, trying to find out something through Gina. But the former landlady either wouldn't talk or truly knew nothing about her trouble-making girl, except that she had left the capital with some biker. The relationship with Stacy left Andrew with a deep wound, a pain he tried to dull with work. Yet there was something he should know. A few weeks after leaving Andrew, Stacy discovered she was pregnant. Unsure whether the father was Andrew or the man for whom she had given up everything. Something stopped her from terminating the pregnancy, and she gave birth to a girl and moved in with kind-hearted Gina. But then Stacy was no longer the blooming beauty who had once come to conquer the capital. She descended into drinking, got involved with another man, and left Gina's place again. But before she had left, placed her 2-year-old daughter Arleen to an orphanage. "Stacy, how could you do this to a child?" Gina was horrified. "But if you don't want her, give her to her father. Isn't Arleen from... what was his name? From Andrew. Give her to him." "No," Stacy grinned. "I won't give him that satisfaction. Don't write me off. I'll get back on my feet and take Arleen back." After that, Gina never saw Stacy again. And now, 25 years later, Andrew returned to the outskirts of the city, to the building where his love story had begun. He hoped Gina still lived in the same house. After asking some boys in the yard, He climbed to the 3rd floor and rang the bell at the shabby door. A timeless woman answered. She could have been 40 or 60. "Hello, are you Gina?" Andrew asked. "Hello? And who are you?" The woman squinted. "Gina, you might remember me. I'm Andrew, your friend Stacy's acquaintance, remember?" Andrew looked at her hopefully, praying she wouldn't slam the door. Recognition dawned in her eyes. "Oh, yes, I remember. What do you want?" "I have a question. Gina, do you know anything about Stacy?" "I haven't heard from her in 20 years. She vanished. She's probably not alive." "Tell me, when she left, was she—" Andrew finally had the courage to ask the main question. "Yes, she was pregnant, though she wasn't sure by whom. She had a girl, named her Arleen. She said she was yours, then gave her to an orphanage. That's all. Hey, are you going to faint? Come on, sit down." A couple of days later, Mr. Toffler called Arleen. Arleen was surprised, certain these strange people would never reappear in her life. "Hello, Arleen?" the old man said with peculiar joy. "Arleen, please come to my son's office right away. Where you were last time." "No, Mr. Toffler, even honouring you, I won't. I'm sorry about your son, but they put people in a special hospital for such behaviour. He needs help." "Arleen, I understand. He must have frightened you. He was acting strangely, but he had his reasons. My child, believe me, when you know the truth, you'll want to apologise to your father." Arleen went to the 20th floor and entered the familiar office. A slender man in a perfectly fitted suit rose from behind the desk to meet her. "Hello, my so long missing daughter," he said simply.